Jeremy, thank you again for having me. Happy to work with the Law, Technology, and Warfare Research Cell. Your distro looks like we're pushing about 70 attendees. I did a scroll through, so I saw some friends and colleagues. So thank you for taking time out of your busy days to listen to my thoughts on Lawfare. I go through. Again, as Jeremy mentioned, my call sign from my Navy days is Patsy from Patsy Klein, the country music singer. I get a lot of blank stares when I mention that as my source of my call sign when I teach my undergrad classes. So it must be timing out as a useful call sign. So we will go to the next slide, please. Hey, Jeremy gave a great introduction. Again, very kind of you. Old Navy guy, aerospace engineer from Georgia Tech. Got to see the world, some places with deserts. Always wanted to be an astronaut. So if you want to be an astronaut in the Navy, you go off the test pilot school. Made it as far as the Navy's astronaut candidate list. Then the Columbia mishap happened. So the center picture there. Off to plan B, CO of our weapons school. Fast forward, one of the things that I did while I was at the Naval War College was write a short paper that was using maritime strategy for space strategy. Became also known as Corbett in Orbit. That paper turned into a book that Jeremy mentioned from 2006. Getting to help the Department of the Air Force out with some space policy and strategy work, adjuncted at GW Space Policy Institute, and as Jeremy mentioned, a 2019 book on understanding space strategy. I do have a bad habit of liking to write books, so I am starting to undertake one on looking at irregular warfare in the space domain, and I'm hopeful that Lawfare will become a chapter in that. So cool, next. Hey, a quick agenda. We're going to talk about Lawfare in the context of strategy. I'm a strategist, not a lawyer by training. Talk about different strategies, the indirect approach, cumulative strategy, protracted strategy, and hopefully get to the so what. So a strategy is only useful if it gives you practical solutions that we can help address some of the world's problems. So next. Okay, most important part, the views expressed are my own, don't necessarily represent the views of Falcon Research, George Washington University, or the US government. Again, no legal education, but I do believe, and I think we're coming to terms with, that the intersection of policy, strategy, and law is important. I know in the United States, we tend to kind of bend those separately, but we need to get the people to think about these holistically as we look at strategic competition. Okay, so a bit about terminology and different perspectives. As used here, I consider Lawfare the use of legal regimes for competitive advantage in space. It's also been defined as the use of the law as a weapon of conflict. I look at it more as a competition because Lawfare can apply outside of hostilities or use of force. So on the aspect, different countries view the law and the legal regimes differently. Perhaps it's no surprise, but I will say it's been my experience within the United States. We acknowledge the views of others, but then we go right back to our bad habits of mirroring others, thinking that other countries or cultures share our same view on the use of the legal regimes or rules-based orders. So based on my research and the work of others, China's view is a more, having activity serve the ends of the political party and support state leadership's objectives. You look at their deterrence theory and their military strategy, they refer to a lot about all aspects unified. So instead of like how we do in the United States, we talk about instruments of national power, we may talk about law, technology, social opinion, and we consider them separately. All these aspects for Chinese strategy is all aspects unified. So when you look at the military actions or military strategies, they want to, through coercion or compellence, get others to submit to Beijing's will. In contrast, the US mostly approach, we look at legal regimes to protect sovereign rights, individual rights, protect property, and discriminate between combatants and non-combatants, such as through the Law Act or humanitarian law. I saw from the list we have a good number of folks from legal backgrounds. If I mutilate the terms of reference, please bear with me. But there's an advantage of that, having someone who's no legal training. We can kind of twist it to apply it to a strategy. Yeah, so the point of lawfare is not necessarily to win a legal argument or to be right. It's using legal regimes for political ends and outside what we would consider a Western approach. So back to, in my presentation today, I'm going to talk a lot about China. We could equally talk about Russia's view. Again, China and Russia don't view things the same, but they do view things differently than the US or Western approach to use of legal regimes. But for the sake of time for this presentation, we'll focus for most of our examples with China. Next slide, please. Okay, so strategy 101. My simplest, best definition for strategy is balancing ends and means. So we have, usually it's political ends or national objectives over here, and then we have the means to achieve those ends. So in the United States, we think about the instruments of national power, diplomacy, information, military, economic. You can also look at technological, social, opinion, and then also lawfare. The most important aspect of the strategy definition is the balancing aspect. If your ends are too grandiose and you don't have the available means, you have an unbalanced or mismatched strategy. Strategies need to be applied to potential competitors. In wartime, we can call those folks adversaries. But if it's not balanced, it's misaligned. So lawfare, or the use of legal regimes for competitive advantage, is a means to achieve political ends as used here. Okay, off to the indirect approach. A lot of the service war colleges, we teach Clausewitz, very military-centric, using force against the centers of gravity to achieve political ends. But there's other views on the use of military strategies and achieving political ends. So one of those was the indirect approach by B.H. Littlehart. He wrote the book Strategy, the Indirect Approach in 1967. He wrote mostly as a counter to the Clausewitzian view about decisive battles. And, sometimes Clausewitz talked about total war, even though he didn't think that was totally achievable. But he saw as a large force-on-force conflicts, the centers of gravity was the wrong approach. His indirect approach incorporates the thought that strategy should adjust as a situation develops in war. So B.H. Littlehart explained how strategy should not seek solely to overcome the adversary's resistance, but should rather exploit any elements to achieve operational advantage by throwing the enemy off balance before potential strike. So instead of going to major force-on-force, what are the other ways we can achieve it? Using today's terminology, asymmetric warfare or asymmetric operations is probably the best way to describe that. But it can be military and it can be non-military to achieve those objectives. So the indirect approach, B.H. Littlehart. Okay, next. Another approach to strategy that we think about is from, is J.C. Wiley's Military Strategy, a General Theory of Power Control, 1967, a naval officer. So according to Wiley, a cumulative strategy uses the minute accumulation of little items piling up on each other until the massive accumulated actions becomes critical. So we call this kind of salami slicing. So it's cumulative, it's tiny little actions that in themselves are inconsequential, but over time they pile up. So long-term cumulative strategies must be met with a response, or else there's a risk that the cumulative strategy achieves its desired strategic effect. This is in contrast to what Wiley called the sequential strategy, where one victory is necessary before the next. So that was more the sequential. Wiley did not see a cumulative approach or salami slicing being able to be decisive in all-out conflicts, but he thought the sequential and cumulative were supportive. Okay, that brings us to Mao Zedong. He wrote about protracted strategy. He incorporated elements of the indirect approach and cumulative strategies, even though he really didn't talk about that in his military writings. But if you look at it, it says, I read as indirect approach and cumulative strategy. So when seeking to protract a war, you look to protract until the situation changes as one favor. Picture of him on the Long March photo. So as broadly interpreted here, that the concept of protracted strategy includes using either non-military or military actions against adversaries. So that's where lawfare would fit in here. Uses the element of time. You're waiting for the situation to change, either for your opponent to get weaker or you to get stronger. Okay, and again, it makes up both indirect and cumulative strategies make up protracted. All right, so this is about lawfare. I framed up overall strategy, indirect and cumulative. So indirect approach, how does lawfare fit? So you can distort legal regimes and rule-based orders to diminish the power of another while advancing one's own power and influence. So it's not trying to win the legal argument, but it's to distort the facts. Obfuscation of facts and actual situation, cause doubt in a world opinion or in competitors, or affect the rest of the world, even folks who are outside your competitors. So as part of a cumulative strategy, you can trumpet your own successes as a model for others to follow. Look to divide allies and partners. So work those contentious issues, whether it's US may have with its allies or other partners may have, and establish one's view as legitimate. And this occurs over time. So again, using time as an advantage. I've been these appropriately, but there is overlap between the indirect approach, cumulative strategy, and protracted. So protracted, hey, delaying the actions or achievements and successes of others. So if you're competing with someone, maybe you can prevent others from achieving their successes at that moment. Lawfare can look to overwhelm domestic and international ports, cause the opponent to expend additional resources, time, energy, and fiscal means. So lawfare is below the threshold of traditional conflict. It's probably below even gray zone operations. But I think that's why US and military culture, we are wired to do well when it comes to conflicts, but anything that's below that threshold, this is something that we're going to have to contend with going forward. Okay, next slide, please. All right, this is my worst eye chart. I apologize, but if you're going to talk lawfare in space, I think you need to talk about the PPWT. It's got a long name. Even I mess it up because I try to abbreviate it. So it's the prevention on the placement of weapons in outer space and of the threat or use of force against outer space objects. Thankfully, we can call it the PPWT. So this was initiated, China and Russia jointly submitted their initial draft PPWT. You had the European Union draft code of conduct going on at the same time. But the PPWT defined space weapons somewhat narrowly to only apply to space or space to earth weapons. So it didn't account for a terrestrial direct descent, hit to kill anti-satellite missiles. But PPWT does serve as a great example. Russia and China also modified the initial draft in 2014, but the major US objections, and if you look at what other legal scholars have written on it, from the US perspective, the most pressing and practical threat was actually not space-to-space weapons, but terrestrial-based direct descent ASATs. There's problems with verification and monitoring. If you have a treaty, arms control treaty, you need to verify compliance, verification, and monitoring. And then also problems with the definition of what a space weapon is. That was ill-defined in that. So what was the intent? From the Western perspective, China and Russia, through intentional omission, obfuscation, sought to preserve terrestrial direct descent ASATs, capabilities which they had well under control, while seeking to limit the perceived US superiority and on-orbit capabilities, all while trumpeting themselves as responsible stakeholders. So, it's trying to limit another and then bolster your own prestige and how you're perceived by the world stage. All right, so we're going to get into analogies. We talked about the PPWT. That's probably the best example, but we don't have a whole lot of historical experience to draw upon when we look at lawfare in the space domain. So a little caveats about analogies. All analogies break down. I'm here speaking to you because way back when I used an analogy to maritime. So let's continue that. But again, it's based on time and a place, but analogies can help us ask the right questions and consider things until such time as we get enough empirical evidence to make our own determination. So South China Sea, great examples, and it just keeps on coming. The map on the left shows that there's different countries with various territorial claims, so sometimes overlapping, so which has caused been a source of contention. I want to talk about the 2019 incident involving the USNS Impeccable. It's a part of the U.S. Military Sea Lift Command. And what happened was back in 2009, the Impeccable was harassed by Chinese vessels. The account was disputed, but basically what happened was the Impeccable was harassed. China's maritime ships out there harassed it and grabbed its towed array, which was an acoustic array used for using sonar to snag with the hook. So the China lashed out the United States, blaming the Navy ship the Impeccable for what it called a violation of international law by conducting surveillance activities in waters where China claims jurisdiction. It disputed the American view that it was the Chinese vessels that had acted aggressively. The PRC spokesman at the time said the U.S. claims are gravely a contravention of the facts and confuse black and white. They are totally unacceptable to China. And as the slide said, they also said when the U.S. presented the video evidence of the events, that that the facts were sheer lies by the United States. So another event is ongoing is the Scarborough Shoal tensions between the Philippines and China. So back in 2012, there was Philippine Navy interacted with 8 mainland Chinese fishing vessels and attempted to apprehend them because they were deviated into Filipino waters as viewed by Philippines. What happened since then, you have reports of China's maritime militia, which are not fishing vessels, but associated with the militia activities of PLA, PRC, and they're operating in the shoals. In the news from yesterday was we have Vice President Harris out there gave a speech, I believe it was in Singapore, and she noted Beijing's coercion and intimidation when it comes to the South China Sea. So I want to use that example. We're going to extrapolate this to space, but I want to be clear. So we're using these terrestrial examples. That's not to say this is what's going to happen or to paint any countries as an adversary at present in the space domain, but I think it's good for helpful as we consider competition. All right, so what we have here, analogies. So we have the far side of the moon, not as a lot of times the dark side of the moon by Pink Floyd, but we have the Chinese lander Shangji and the U2 rover landed on the far side of the moon. I believe they're still operational, but we want to use this as an example. So we have United States, we have China, we have commercial companies going to the moon. Folks are looking at resource extraction. As we know, or if you've read the Outer Space Treaty from 1967, there can be no national appropriation by claims of sovereignty. But you have US policy is that commercial companies can use the moon and celestial bodies for commercial purposes, resource extraction, and the like. So the scenario I'd like to do, and I'm not sure it comes out very well on that bottom right, I think it has NASA on the side. So instead of trying to say, okay, we're going to have South China Sea on the moon, well, what's something that's more problematic? Let's say the Outer Space Treaty stays in effect, no territorial claims, but you have competing interests, and we can say those are resource extraction or setting certain precedents in the future. So what we have is we have a lander and then we have a rover, but if you can see in the picture, there's a tether to it. And I wanted to kind of bring out, so US policy is we follow the Outer Space Treaty, no claims of sovereignty. But if you look at the SecDef's recent tenets of responsible behavior and you look at the Artemis Accords, one constant theme is safe and professional. So I believe, Operation Space should be safe and professional, maintain safety when you start exploring the moon. You can avoid heritage sites and the like. So let's take on the safety. So if you have a rover that's attached to a tether by its lander, and you need that tether for communication, it would make sense. Hey, it's 10 meters long, stay away, there's some safety. So what happens if we start extrapolating that tether to 10 kilometers? or start saying you need to have the radio frequency spectrum to maintain safe operations and the like. So do you have to, you're not building an exclusion zone, it's not a keep out zone, it's a safety zone, you know, to maintain safe operations. So is that one way to get around and try to carve out the different spheres where you can maintain some type of autonomy and keep others out? I don't know. It's more of a question, but I think we need to start addressing and debating what safety of operations looks like on the moon as we explore, especially with the Artemis program going forward. All right. So again, I try to look at it from a strategy point of view. For every strategy, there is a counter. So how do you counter lawfare? You could say it's also the same as how we try to counter strategic competition from the US perspective with others. So you have to work to prevent the eroding of legal regimes by distorting their meaning. It's pretty simple, you know, working with allies and like-minded partners, but that includes the commercial space companies. The commercial industry is going to have more systems on orbit if they don't already, you know, proliferated LEO, mega constellations. So the commercial sector is going to be important for setting normative behavior, what we consider acceptable, what we consider safe. Countries also have a role in that, but from some people's perspective, you could argue that collectively commercial may have more of influence on setting what we consider normative behavior and safe operations than a lot of governments. So working with that seems pretty obvious, so we're doing that. But the other part is cumulative approaches like lawfare must be addressed or else they achieve strategic effect over time. So we got to collectively honor the legal regimes as we acknowledge the rules-based orders that we've set up. But when folks look to counter it, whether it's South China Sea or any type of coercive actions, you have to address them. If you do not, then over time, they can achieve strategic effect. Okay, so people may say, what is a strategist? Potentially, a strategist is someone who quotes dead people. So again, to carry that vein of quoting dead people, but I think it kind of frames the context of lawfare. I talked about 2 points, working with allies and partners in commercial to uphold the legal regimes. But the other part is, you know, having the political will to actually counter those coercive actions as they slowly seek to erode our freedom of action. So everything in war is very simple, but the simplest thing is difficult. So the counter lawfare in itself is a very simple concept. Countering it is very simple, but as a practical matter, as we work together to address strategic competition, it may prove more difficult. So Jeremy, I am done and open for questions. Hopefully folks feel like they got their money's worth, but we'll see. You know, I'm looking to learn from you guys too in this, and I will take down notes appropriately.
Sir, I'll just go ahead and kick things off. I think that, you know, obviously one of the biggest recent developments, especially for those of us in the military and those of us who are following space, is the creation of the US Space Force, right, back at the end of 2019. Could you speak for maybe a few moments on your opinions of the creation of the Space Force, how it kind of overarchingly affects US space policy, and what you see as ways in which the Space Force can, you know, utilize space or act in space to help ensure American interests?
Thanks for the questions. So the U.S. Space Force, per law, is the responsibility for organized, train, and equip, presenting forces to the combat commands. I think it's a key component. I know they're working hard to establish the policies. So I would categorize Space Force and U.S. Space Command as part of the military instrument of national power. It needs to work in concert with our other instruments of national power, or State Department diplomacy, informational, and the economic. So don't forget commerce. You know, when you talk to commerce reps, as we look at competition, they want to unleash the power of commercial. So from the U.S. perspective, what are our strategic advantages? So we have allies and partners. Not all countries have that, and you know, we mostly get along, and at least we acknowledge what we disagree on. But the other thing is the innovation and technology from the commercial sector. So we got to understand the commercial, especially as we expand out the role. Maybe it's an inordinate role of the commercial sector in establishing that. But Space Force, reading their capstone documents, they're acknowledging a lot of these items. I think we need to work collectively. The department's working on an updated national defense strategy, and I know, deterring others, and that's all about messaging and credibility and communicating your capabilities. But I think there will be fundamental with that, and U.S. Space Command's doing the same thing. They have those efforts, scenario-based events that look at this. So key and fundamental, but again, I want to caution folks, we're used to bending. So the military folks like to talk about military folks, but we need to cross-pollinate and start arguing, hey, what's the intersection between policy strategy, deterrence strategy, what's the appropriate deterrence mechanism, and then also talk to the legal folks as far as anything that we advocate needs to be perceived as legitimate or commensurate with our view of the law.
Great, thank you, sir. Really appreciate the response. So we've gotten a few questions flowing in both the Q&A and the chat. First question that came in, sir, is from Dr. Andrea Harrington. And what Dr. Harrington asks is, we talk a lot about lawfare and treaties. Great examples, Outer Space Treaty, the attempted use of the PPWT, right, as you addressed. Do you have thoughts about the relationship between lawfare and the development of customary international law?
Okay, well, thank you, Andrea. I appreciate that, and a great seeing you a few weeks ago. So I'll probably speak over my head, but I will note that the customary international law, differing from treaty law, the norms of behavior as they're established over time can affect our customary understanding of international law. So it's important. Again, back to that cumulative strategy and protracted. So if you can establish now what you consider to be responsible behaviors influencing future norms of behavior, and I want to throw out this, there's a difference between them, and you get about 20 people in the room will argue about which is which, but it is important, and it is important now because the actions you're taking today, 10 to 20 years from now, they could be considered customary international law or norms of behavior that we generally accept as true. So, but I will highlight, norms and customary international law is not established by writing a memo. You need to have demonstrated action. It needs to occur over time. For the cautions for the U.S. folks, any policies you want, it's best if you follow from a credibility point of view and also establishment. So it's also by words and deeds, but you're exactly right. It is important that we start thinking about those now. And the DoD tenets of responsible behavior is a great start. So I'm very happy about that.
Great, sir. Next question is from Adrian Times of CubeCab. And Adrian asks, posits a scenario. So let's say there was a private US operation on the moon's surface, maybe space mining, prospecting, or something similar. If Chinese rovers, either manned or automated, robotic, drone, came along to, quote, closely inspect the operations, close enough that perhaps they just happened to keep cutting cables, damaging hardware, etc., what would be an appropriate response by the private operator? And then follow-up question, would counterforce against those rovers, maybe initiated and conducted entirely by the private operator, be at all appropriate, or should the commercial operator be prepared to take a loss while the US government files legal challenges or takes other action?
Wonderful, rich question. I appreciate that. So most likely, in that case, you're talking about a commercial company not considered mission essential for national security purposes. My guess it's going to be a claim through as a, not as a crime, but basically a loss of property. So I would file a claim for getting any type of loss of funds, taking away your capability through the court, filing the appropriate U.S. jurisdiction court that the Chinese rover took away your property, and your ability to earn income based on that. I want to point out, and it kind of touched on the South China Sea. A lot of folks have been writing about China's view of commercial is not the same as the United States view as commercial. So, Chinese companies, most of them are for profit, but let's be clear, most of them, the party and the PLA have hooks in that. So you may have commercial companies acting on behalf of the party or the leadership. So we just need to acknowledge that's the state. I'm not looking to say it should be any different, but let's come to address, and I think going forward, we're gonna have to wonder about that, especially going back to that South China Sea, Scarborough Shoal, and others. So what are we gonna do when that happens? I don't think a counterforce or any type of active force would be justified there any more than harassment. As it stands right now, no loss of life. I don't think it reaches that occasion where it would be anything else. Now that could change in the future if you're talking about mission essential equipment or something else. But great question.
Question, sir, from Adam Ganest. Sorry, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. And Adam writes, could you please readdress our nation's objections to the PPWT? I think, meaning just could you re-explain what the United States key objections are to the PPWT? And then related question, what should our counter proposal be to the international community that is different than the core elements of the PPWT? If we wanted a counter proposal to the PPWT, what could or should that look like?
Okay. I'll try to, let me answer the last part. So it's been consistent with US policy throughout most administrations, probably the last 6 national space policy that per the Outer Space Treaty, peaceful purposes means non-aggressive. All right, so folks that are dialing here probably been involved in these discussions, but my understanding is that we consider the Outer Space Treaty as written, as interpreted by US policy, to be sufficient enough to address those. To go back to the objections, because Russia's proposal was looking to address weapons in the space environment, but they weren't looking to limit or address the terrestrial base ASAT, so the direct descent hit to kill. So you're looking to ban weapons, or at least to address space weapons. But from the US point of view, it was incomplete, and it was singling out what was most likely the most likely course for a weapon to be used in the space environment, which is at your direct descent ASATs. You can only have any viable arms control treaty, which is what this would be. It needs to be enforceable, and if you can't have a way to verify compliance or monitor, especially when it comes to the space-based, then it's probably not worth much. You could say if they included ASATs, and you could do terrestrial inspections like we do in the START treaties and stuff like that. And then again, questions about what is a space weapon, trying to limit capability, but there's still not agreement on what that weapon would be. So that's my understanding. Hopefully I didn't butcher it for the folks who were actually involved from this call, but I think that's the main points. It was incomplete. It wasn't all encompassing to actually address the weapons that were most likely to be used in combat, especially what China and Russia actually had.
Question from Clayton Bosler. He writes, Patsy, the discussions around who and what to defend in space, especially with respect to commercial assets in space, is a very complex issue. How do you see Lawfare impacting this complex calculus?
Thank you, Clay, for that. Wish I could meet you in person again, but maybe soon. So for the commercial's role is going to be paramount as we look to deter strategic competition and deter conflict in space. Will there be a time when commercial capabilities will reach a threshold where they should be included in type of national security protections or not? I'll let others talk about that, but it's going to be paramount. I think we need to, US government-wide, we need to kind of figure out what's important, what's not, how we communicate to our commercial partners in peacetime and potential conflict, and what we're thinking and what we consider helpful. Again, I think those relationships, lesser so than Russia, but more so with China, we need to understand what their role of commercial is. Do we consider commercial capabilities on orbit the same as we consider U.S. commercial companies? How does the law of armed conflict apply? A whole bunch of questions we got to start wrestling with. These are not easy. That's why it's part of Lawfare. Because if it was easy, we wouldn't be talking about it now. But you're exactly right. They are pivotal to that. I'm not going to address the national security side of that question, but we need to start having that dialogue and start looking at those in various scenarios.
Sir, a related question from GAL. Do you envision the U.S. Space Force engaging in police activity to protect U.S. commercial and economic interests in space, in addition to performing a military function, right? You made the maritime analogy. Obviously, one of the key purposes of navies, both for the British, the Americans, right, is protecting commerce on the high seas. So could you speak to that, sir? Thank you.
Okay, so Jeremy, you talked about the Coast Guard thing, so I'm gonna get on my soapbox. Yeah, exactly to that point. If you look at the purpose of navies, part of that was to protect commerce and trade in the Aegis sail. But let's, when we talk about the blue water, brown water analogies, we should move out from that. So, the purpose of a navy, even from the British lineage, was to do a whole bunch of stuff. But let's be clear. So commerce and trade was important. You had to protect those interests. It was also power projection. It was decisive battles. They did littoral operations, presence, coercion. So there's that protecting economics piece, but there's the military, and there's sending ships to the bottom of the sea is also the Navy's job too. So to answer your question, do I think the Space Force or the role that Space Command play in the policing? At this point, no. I know that some folks will disagree with me on that. There was debate early on whether it should be a Space Corps, more of a policing Coast Guard function. But my philosophy is, we have national security interests in space. I think that's pretty evident. We've had that for decades. And then you need a military element to protect those interests using the military instrument of national power. But great question. I know we're still debating it. Also, the question that comes up, the Space Force doesn't know what it's doing. What is it trying to achieve? What I wrote in the 2019 book, this was before the decision had become final, but I like General Krulak from the Marine Corps answered, why do we have a Marine Corps? And to paraphrase, we have a Marine Corps because the American people want a Marine Corps. They have a very fine Army, an Air Force, and Navy. And I think to a certain extent, Space Force may fall into that same way. We recognize the value of space, and it was seen as a time when a separate service. But policing, not at this point. There may come a time when that would change. You do have part of that balancing of strategy I'll go back to was ends and means. Do you have the fiscal or financial means to stand up a separate component that looks to policing or a Coast Guard safety constabulary force? So just my thoughts.
Great, thank you, sir. Slight change in topic. So Michael Jensen of the NIWDC Space Ops has a question about partners and partnership. He says, speaking of partners, do we see anyone outwardly working with China in their cumulative approaches to space? Or are they seen kind of as a singular bully in this realm?
No, that's a wonderful question. It's happened recently, but China has announced its own space station. Russia's in talks to join that. Last reporting, I haven't seen the full report, but China's been talking to international partners about joining their space station. And as you go back to cumulative, that's going to be very important when as China forms these relationships with these other countries, establishing normative behavior, what considered ops, then getting to sign on to a variation of maybe a China's version of an Artemis Accords like. But no, it's not. I think they recognize the importance of a cumulative strategy, indirect approach, in that if they're going to compete, they're going to need to have some of these agreements. We could talk about how they do fishing rights in the South China Sea similarly and how that works out. But They do understand it, and that makes the problem that much more difficult for us. So what would I say? We need to continue working with allies and partners in the commercial sector aggressively. Will we prevent one from going to the other? I wouldn't look at that from a binary point of view. We may have competing customers on the US version of space station, whenever we get to that point. There's been talks of having a commercial space station as a follow-on to International Space Station. That might be another venue for us to continue establishing responsible behaviors and safety of operations. But yeah, this is going to be an enduring question that we'll be wrestling with some time.
Similar-ish sort of question with respect to allies and international partnerships. Mr. Ben Huff of SAF-SP says accountability involves having the capacity to observe and detail bad behavior, right? Bad behavior in any environment. But this is particularly challenging given the expanses of space, celestial bodies, etc. And he says this has to be a team sport with allied participation. Who is going to lead this effort of observing, finding, detailing, and publicizing bad behavior in outer space?
Ben, thank you for that question. I will mail you your $20 after the event, but thanks for that. So I'm gonna bend that question. So you have to talk about observing bad behavior and the like. I'm going to talk about attribution. So one of the things that I write about routinely is deterrence strategy. So if we're trying to deter conflict or malicious or nefarious actions in space, how do you do that? Well, you need to have a credible response, and folks have to know that you can see it and attribute it. Attribution just doesn't happen, okay? So a lot of competing information. We may have commercial space situational awareness, some other activities, and we're putting it together, and you may have a probability function. By 100%, we know who it is. And you're gonna have to wrestle with that reality. But attribution is something that we need to incorporate into our military strategies or deterrence strategies. That has to communicate your capabilities. You need to know who your trusted partners with that. Are you do a zero trust type of environment, feeding commercial, national, military, and other collection sources to observe, to know what's happening, and to attribute, hopefully, to a single person or organization, some type of malicious activity. But we have a long way to go. What organization? I won't speak to that. I think the other folks on the line can speak to that, but I know there's some hard work at U.S. Space Command being done on attribution, how that's integrated and communicated, and I'll defer to the experts of others on that.
Another question from Mr. Adam Ganest. Again, apologies if I am mispronouncing your name. Are there examples of Lawfare successfully deterring or dissuading Chinese actions in the South China Sea? Or are there any specific examples of where China backed away from a claim or stopped, some activity, patrolling, building, etc., as a result of either international or U.S. legal processes?
Right, so wonderful question, and I'm going to kind of frame that as kind of like deterrence. It's hard to prove a negative. How do you prove why something did not happen? I will say, the impeccable tensions that we had was, I think it was 2009. So nothing's happened since that to that extent against U.S. vessels, but Filipino fishermen are dealing with it every day. So does that mean that our actions are rebuttal to it, are coming out with video evidence, dissuaded Chinese actions for continued? It's unclear on that regard. I will say so is there any examples where we were able to counter successfully China's lawfare or the lawfare of others? The PPWT arguments, whenever you see communications coming out of the UN with the delegations from Russia and China, they'll just copy and paste the same PPWT arguments, whether they're germane or not. So I can see, did we stop that from happening? No, but we'll still need to counter it, because if we don't, then that can achieve effect over time. But it's difficult because it's below the threshold of conflict, and it's just, it's such a, like a gnat always buzzing around your head. You're going to still have to deal with it, but it's hard to prove a negative. So sorry, it's hard.
A quick comment from Captain Blocksma of the Marine Corps, who appreciates your comments about Americans wanting a Marine Corps. Hoorah! All right, awesome. Sir, just in terms of maybe an additional question from me as we wait for some more to filter in through the chat. In some of your writings, you've written about strategic mismatches, right? And you spoke earlier in your presentation about that balance, right, of strategic ends and means. Maybe a little bit of a difficult or loaded question, or one that perhaps you don't feel comfortable speaking to, but just in terms of either the United States as a whole policy establishment or the United States military specifically, do you see any such strategic mismatches or anything that you believe is over or underbalancing that scale of strategy?
I do, and you know, I've written about it even after the book. Dean Chang and I wrote about some strategy mismatches. Dean studied China's writings on military strategy. The biggest thing to harp back is the U.S. historically, and it's not just today, has a problem with mirroring and presentism. So mirroring is thinking your adversary or your competitor looks and thinks the way you do. Far from the truth. You read anything on Russia and China history, different strategic cultures, historical experience, different ways of thinking. So we got that. And the problem is, even if we acknowledge that, and we're getting better about that, acknowledging that difference, when you start looking at our course of action development and type of mission planning, it's still from a Western American values perspective. So if you're looking to deter, you looked at your cost benefit ratios, but we project what we believe as cost imposition and what they value, a potential competitors value from a US perspective. The other part is presentism. So in defense planning, we'll routinely is a thought, hey, we understand the situation today, tomorrow is going to look like today, but only more so. So we have these 5-year cycles, we got to plan accordingly. History is a cruel teacher at times, but as we can see with the pandemic and others, sometimes large discontinuities happen. You can say how the Cold War ended, the 9/11 attacks. So these major events, and we shift, and then we forget that we shifted, and we think it's just a continuation. Good grief! After 9/11, you just read some stuff. Everything was counterinsurgency, coin. So it goes in vogue, and we kind of forget that. Hey, maybe we need to plan for a range of futures. The future is unpredictable in any detail. So if you're going to have a fulsome military strategy and you want to deter a range of competitors, given an uncertain future, you need to have a toolbox with a lot of tools. So back to your original question. So China and US have fundamentally different perspectives on deterrence. As it was written, we think about the inherent right of self-defense and we're going to dissuade. So we want to dissuade others from attacking us. We have the inherent right of self-defense. We have the UN Charter. If you attack us, then we have a right to respond. And the law of armed conflict kicks in. China's view is a little bit more nuanced and complicated from our perspective. They, instead of their word for deterrence, translates more accurately to compellence. So if you look at their phases of conflict, it's not like this old phase structure of ours, but they can use what would be considered acts of force or coercive actions to compel others. And I think we see that in the South China Sea. My concern is if you don't acknowledge that they may use very aggressive coercive actions, from the US mindset, we say, I think we were just attacked. Where they may be China may actually be trying to deter further escalation. US has a long history of going right up the escalation ladder, right? Here, right, self-defense kicks in, let's start mobilizing, whatever like that, but that may not have been the intent. So we need to understand better China and actually Russia's view of unacceptable. Russia has a different view, unacceptable consequences, but that's for a separate discussion. So yeah, this mismatch is still in place. We're getting better. The last writings I've seen come out from folks being confirmed, recognize, again, back to your question, what's the so what? Jeremy saying, hey, if we acknowledge this, more of a deterrence but denial of benefit, we may not be able to deter a coercive action based on strategic culture of China and how they view competition. But maybe we can convey the futility of action. Maybe with allies and partners in the commercial sector, if you deterrence by denial of benefit in a space perspective is just space mission assurance and resiliency. So if we have what we say is important, mission assurance and resiliency, multi-domain solutions, work with allies, partners, you can hopefully convey the futility. You can do whatever you want to that one-off satellite. It's not going to matter. You can do a cyber attack here, but it's not going to matter because we have 100 other ways. So I think that deterrence by denial of benefit is a better way to approach strategic competition with China and Russia. Deterrence by punishment still needs to come into play just because each are mutually supportive. But yeah, it's a great question. I appreciate you asking.
No, phenomenal answer, sir. Thank you. Really appreciate it. And while you were answering my question, sir, a number of others flowed into the Q&A box. I know that we are at 8:55. We're coming up on 9 o'clock. But sir, do you mind taking a few more questions?
Sure, happy to.
Awesome. All right, first question is from Pete Hayes. What are the legal issues surrounding approaches the U.S. Space Force could take to improve the resilience of its capabilities and the capabilities of its international and commercial partners on which it relies? Are there legal impediments for exercising offensive counterspace operations, defensive counterspace operations, self-defense, etc., or actions by international and commercial partners?
Well, thank you, Pete. I think that answer will take about an hour to answer that. So we'll take some of that to offline. But let me take the first part and maybe touch on the last part. So what can the Space Force or Space Command do? We'll say to improve deterrence by denial of benefit, working with allies, partners, and the commercial. Again, progress has been made, but we got more to do. We need to communicate with our allies what it is, how they play in our overall strategy of deterrence. US, we have a very large budget. A lot of these country space programs do not have the same budget, and they don't have the resources to waste building a system that is not complementary or supportive for the allied or our partner strategy. So we need to do a better job of communicating. Some of that's declassification. Folks have talked about that. We're still wrestling with it. Kudos for Space Command and Space Force for still fighting that. Any allies on the call, please don't give up on us. Keep on beating us up about our classification concerns, and we need to make it more releasable. On the commercial side, we need to have better flow, even at an unclassified level. What is it you want? If we're going to outcompete competitors, commercial innovation is going to be key to that. How do you incentivize commercial to actually innovate? It's a different model. Look at more of a space as a service type of arrangement instead of the U.S. government historically likes to buy. Again, great progress has been made in acknowledging that, figuring out what services you can buy commercially. There are certain services we're not going to outsource commercially, okay? Those are very critical, and that makes sense. But can we explain, hey, these we want to own, these we want to buy as a service, and use the data analytics that comes from that. But we got to get out of commercials' way so they can innovate and hopefully not do an overly requirements-based approach. Legal impediments. Yeah, I mean, the ITAR kind of kicks in. We have CFIUS, Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., or at least certain countries. We want to avoid them coming in, but we need to figure out who our trusted partners are, figure out classifications, information sharing, how that's done to outcompete. But a wonderful question, Pete, and thanks for joining the call.
Great, sir. Thank you. Another question from Dr. Harrington. Do you believe that there's a first mover advantage in Lawfare? I'd appreciate if you would address how your answer influences approaches to integrating Lawfare in strategy.
Cool. How much? I got 2 minutes. All right. I will. Hey, that's a loaded and wonderful question. I'm going to back up. I'm going to take it out of Lawfare first. There's a perceived first mover advantage when it comes to space ops, right? Big juicy targets. We're vulnerable. Okay. If from a Clausewitzian point of view, that is total bunk. According to Clausewitz, the defense is a stronger form of war, even though you need the offense to win. The problem is what we're doing in space is not defensive at all. Defensive is mission assurance resilience, not making yourself vulnerable. The analogy I give is, hey, colonial times, we had rows of folks just lining up to trade musket fire. Not very good defenses. If you're behind a fortification, a river, or some type of embankment, that is making preparations, is what Clausewitz calls it. We need to make preparations now to make sure that the defense is the stronger form, not being vulnerable. That could be distribution, disaggregation, all the forms of mission assurance and resilience. Is there a first mover advantage in Lawfare? I don't really see that. I think it's more part of the cumulative strategy. So if you move first, it's just going to take so much time to erode. It can put you back, and you need to be prepared for a range of potential actions and futures for Lawfare, but not necessarily on that aspect. But there is a perceived first mover advantage in space, but I think that is erroneous.
Major Brian Green asks, is lawfare something we should view in pejorative terms as an abuse of legal mechanisms, or should we characterize maybe even our own US efforts to promote legitimacy through law as a form of lawfare?
I think it's probably more the latter. I try to be strategy, the facts are the facts. I think it's the Lawfare blog. If you look at their definition, it's two-part. It's the twisting, and I think they comment the U.S. has its own problems with maintaining its viewpoint on the legal regime. So you can look at it both ways. I don't consider it pejorative. I think we have to understand that legal regimes, rule-based wars will be twisted for different folks' opinion. And I think you can look throughout historical experience, any type of great wars where we've twisted facts, both sides have twisted it. So we just need to be aware that is a part of your means to achieve your end. So it's not pejorative, it's more just factual. This is the way it is.
Somewhat similar lawfare related question from Major Tyler Senna. Do you see lawfare as a necessary part of a holistic strategy to ensure access to and use of space, in light of the fact that the US has a challenge of recurring political party changes that may affect America's ability for a consistent long-term strategy?
From a U.S. perspective, I don't think we want to uphold, the legal regimes. U.S. policy is consistent. We have a long track record over the administrations, even though they do come and go. I would say space policy has been fairly constant. In that regard, maybe some final tweaks as far as military security or homeland security and the like. So I think the United States needs to acknowledge that's going to be a forum for others to compete with us. I would not advocate taking on a strategy of twisting our interpretation or a Western view of the law. I think democracies are different than autocratic governments, and that's a good thing. And sure, democracies are inefficient. Working with allies takes more time, but it's all worth it in the end, based on our democratic values.
One more question, and this is a follow-up question from Adrian Times, kind of expanding upon the scenario that was proposed earlier. So as you'll recall, that was about Chinese rovers maybe interfering with private US hardware on the moon. Follow-up question, what would be the legal ramifications if that private operator had no faith in being able to recover damages through the court system, right? Judgment aside, right? Even if they won, maybe China would simply refuse to pay, right? And so that company did in fact engage in counterforce sufficient to destroy the Chinese rovers, with the private operator just claiming that they were engaged in kind of their own form of self-defense on their own initiative. Could you speak to that. And it says, assume that any video or similar evidence is claimed to be entirely invented by whichever side the evidence goes against.
Sure. Well, we could talk about deep fakes. Before addressing that hypothetical, I want to say that the underwriting industry is involved in space launch and stuff like that. So, even before you do a civil case to get damages from any type of actions in this scenario, your insurance may kick in, depending on the underwriting process and what's covered. So if it's, if it covers unintentional harm by other activities, maybe you don't need to resort to type of active force. Was it, I have so many questions with that. Was it actually in self-defense? Was it done after the fact? I think that would open up, I don't have a good solution. So let's take it back off space. So let's say it happens, like we have pirates off the coast of Somalia, when the pirates went after the tankers and they opened, either they hid or opened up with a 50 cal or took with small arms. So if you're trying to protect property and people, and if you feel threatened, I think my understanding is you probably would have some legal basis for the use of force if you felt threatened and needed to protect yourself. Does property rise to the occasion in this scenario? I'll leave it to others that are smarter than me would know how that would do. Maybe the court of choice depends on that outcome. I know European criminal courts, Europeans have a different level of what they call threshold or the gravity of the situation. My understanding is the US interpretation understands the inherent right of self-defense, but doesn't need necessarily to reach a certain threshold. That's an awesome question. I don't have a good answer. And that's the type of stuff we're going to be wrestling with different countries' perspectives.
Sir, do you have any concluding remarks?
No, I really appreciate the dialogue, the wonderful questions. Thanks for having me, and looking forward to the great events that you're going to be doing in the future. So thank you.